Yeah, this talk is called Reclaiming 2012, the Transformative Vision. Because what I really think needs to happen at the moment is that we need to be able to assess this particular time, this particular moment in our story and what its significance is. And really kind of like cut away from all of the hype, all of the speculation, all of the kind of fear-mongering, and really drill into why is this moment significant? What is it about 2012 that captures the public imagination? Because here we are, it's Burning Man 2012. It's kind of like it's a potent time. It's a potent moment. So, in really explaining what 2012 is about, we have to start with the basics, which is really about the Mayan, fundamentally. And what we're talking about is the end of a 5,125-year cycle in history, and that falls on December 21st, 2012. So this really interesting historical fact, and this incredibly intelligent, sophisticated, elegant calendar system comes to a period ending on this winter solstice coming. And what does that mean? What does that mean to us? Well, we kind of have to look at, firstly, at like what it's come to mean, which is quite different from what I would suggest it actually means. So, I mean, maybe we could start actually by just kind of, you know, like, just starting with like just a shout out about what does 2012 mean to you? Time of change. Anyone else? What does 2012 mean to you? The awakening. Any other takers? 2012 doesn't mean anything to you?
We're moving more towards Galactic Center, so people are...
The Galactic Center.
An energy change as we move around the percent.
Cool. Yeah. That's good. We're at Burning Man, so I was expecting a kind of a positive uptake on that. But let's look at this other meaning of 2012, the one that's become the most pervasive and popular meaning. And that really is that the idea is that 2012 is the end of the world. The Mayan calendar ends. The Maya predicted that it's the end of the world, it's the end of the universe. Well, that's what we're going to be sort of navigating here in this journey. It's really an exploration about that idea, where it came from, what it means, and also an alternative reading of the same facts, suggesting this is a period of transformation. So just some facts to begin with. 2012 being the end of the world, there was a poll done by a large surveying company called Ipsos, and they basically spoke to people in 20 different countries, 10,000 different people. And what they found is that 10% of the world's population think that December 21st is the end of the world. That's a pretty amazing thing. Really, what is happening in the public imagination is that this idea of 2012 somehow has become spread, it's become pervasive, it's been picked up by people. They know about it. And one of the really striking things about this is that it's not just in the Western world. 20% of the people in China who were surveyed by Ipsos thought that December 21st was going to be the end of the world. So what we have is this incredibly pervasive idea which is out there. And December 21st, 2012 is pretty much the second most globally recognized date since the millennium. So it's definitely this very, very significant portal. There was another survey by National Geographic, and they asked the question, do you think a major catastrophic event is likely on December 21st? 27% of American adults thought so. So how did we get here? I mean, I think quite a few people have seen the movie 2012, but 2012 didn't start out like that. The ideas about 2012 didn't start out like that. And what I'm going to suggest is the reading of the Mayan calendar doesn't really suggest that either. So 2012 has become a tale of two stories, and they basically can be defined as apocalypse, the end of the world, versus transformation, or the beginning is near. And that's a very interesting set of ideas, because they're really suggestive of two completely different paradigms, and yet the origin point is the same thing. It's the Mayan calendar. People are interpreting something which is an objective other thing and kind of making meaning around it. They're making stories about it. So I'm going to kind of go into that and talk about the origin point of these two different stories, the story of apocalypse and the story of transformation, and talk about where these ideas actually came from and who basically first put that out into the world. So in the transformative vision of 2012, the first person that really mentioned that idea was Jose Agüez. And in 1975, he wrote a book called The Transformative Vision, and it really wasn't about the Mayan calendar. What he was interested in was basically art and its potential for transformation. And in that book, he highlighted 2012 as a fulcrum for possible change. So this was the first time in print that someone had basically stepped forward and said, well, there's a meaning behind this. There is, there's something happening here. And then in 1987, Jose wrote a book called The Mayan Factor, which went on to be a New York Times bestseller. And in that, he kind of outlined a bigger idea of December 21st being the end of history. But that's a much, much later point. That's in 1987. So the origin point of the transformative vision began at that point. But to really understand what we're talking about, we have to kind of drop in a little bit with what the Mayan calendar is, because if we just say the Mayan calendar, it's kind of like not really describing the essence of why this thing is interesting. It's not a calendar for the Maya. It's basically a mathematical notation system which is incredibly flexible and which has led to the evolution of a calendrical system which is unsurpassed in human culture. So the essence of this, the basic underlying system, which is kind of like at the root of the Mayan calendar system, is the most simple counting system ever devised. It's a vigesimal counting system, which means that it's 0 to 19 rather than the base 10 system we have. So you can think about that as simply counting on your, instead of counting on your fingers, it's counting on your fingers and toes. It's basically a very, very powerful way of counting at its core. So this base 20 number system can be translated into these 20 symbols, which form the core of a calendrical system. And it can be somewhat confusing because, you know, people talk about there being multiple calendars, but really the thing which glues them all together is this repeating cycle of 20 days, which basically begins with Imish, or alligator, or crocodile, depending on the interpretation you want to have, and goes through the sun, a how. And then the cycle repeats again. So it's very different from the calendar we use in the West at the moment. You know, we base our calendar on the year and pretty much the day. These are the astronomical units we deal with. So the Maya had this notational system which basically was repeating this 20 cycle. So the next cycle up from this is called the Tzolk'in. And the Tzolk'in is really the kind of the gearbox of all the different Mayan calendars. And this basically is just the cycle of 20 repeating and 13 different variations of each of those numbers. So you get this matrix which starts in the top left-hand corner with one Imish or one dragon and finishes at the bottom right-hand corner with 13 a how. So you basically go from the top left-hand corner down in columns until you reach the bottom of the furthest right column. And then the whole cycle repeats again. And what's interesting to observe about this is that these numbers are found in human biology. We already mentioned that the 20 is the number of fingers and toes that we have. We also have 13 major articulations in our body, so 13 major joints. If you add 13 and 20 together, you get 33. 33 is the number of vertebrae in the human spine. And if you multiply 13 by 20, you get 260, which is basically the average length of time from the last menstruation to birth in human pregnancy. And that's one of the stories that the contemporary Maya, the indigenous Maya of today, teach the calendar with. So they teach kids when they're learning this calendrical system, yeah, this is the cycle of birth. So it's a cycle of birth they're talking about at a fundamental level in their calendar. So it's a remarkable thing that this calendar reflects human biology, but it's an even more remarkable thing that this calendrical system reflects a harmony outside of ourselves in the different planetary orbits. So 3 Tzolk'ins basically is 1 Martian year, that's the 260 days times 3, and you find this kind of fractal, this fractal of 260 repeating itself in lots of different cycles. This is actually research by my research partner Jeff Stray, who wrote a remarkable book called Beyond 2012. It's kind of an encyclopedic resource about all the different ideas about 2012. And these are just some of the alignments that he picked up about this cycle. So in a way, what we're talking about is a biologically resonant counting system. So it's reflected in human biology, that then is also reflected outside of ourselves in all these different planetary harmonics. So in a way, now we're getting down to the essence of why this is interesting, why this is important, because it's not fundamentally about the Maya, it's about a counting system which has this kind of resonance. So this idea of transformation, which was kind of put forward by Jose Arguelles, one of the key ideas that he put forward in the book, The Mayan Factor in 1987, is one of the defining ideas of the transformative vision of 2012. And what that notion is that you take this 260-day cycle, this module, and you kind of project it on this much longer cycle called the long count. And it's the long count that to be more specific, the 13 Bactum cycle of the long count, which is finishing on December 21st, 2012. So this cycle began August 11th, 3113 BC. It's 5,125 years long. And what Jose noticed was that right at the beginning of this cycle, you had the very beginnings of what we know as history. So that's effectively the period where humans were moving into civilized kind of like city sort of societies. And 3,113 BC pretty much marks the beginning of the Sumerian civilization. You have also the beginning of the Egyptian civilization. So the notion that he had, the interpretation that he placed upon the 5,125 year cycle was that, what about if we think about this as a kind of story, a narrative, a cycle that is coming to a close in a time that we're actually privileged to live in. So if you project the last 5,125 years of history onto the 13 Bactum count, and you can see this matrix here, which is basically this fractal matrix of the Tzolk'in, this 260-day repeated cycle, blown up to the 13 Bactum count. And what you get is you get a story out of this, you get a layer of meaning about history that is otherwise non-available. So there's some kind of interesting, funky things about this story, one of which is that if you look right at the center, you can see there's an image of Buddha at the top. And that's because the birth of Buddha actually happens at the exact midpoint of this 5,125 year cycle. And the industrial culture, the Industrial Revolution, is pretty much all the way down in the second half of the last column. And of course, where we are in this story is we're right down in the last box of this 260 box, 5,125 year cycle in the very last year. So it's like if you were reading a 5,125 page like kind of cliffhanger, a book of history, literally. We're on the last page, and we don't know the outcome. You know, it's like, what is going to happen? But this is the idea that really is at the fundament of the idea of the transformative vision. And Jose went on to create some other calendar systems, which were kind of interpretations of these harmonics. But that was one of the most powerful original ideas about what 2012 meant. And sometimes there's so many different interpretations. I mean, there's hundreds and hundreds of books written about 2012, channeled books. There's books about people's opinions about what's going to happen. But this was one of the original ideas. So one of the other original ideas, interestingly enough, was also put into print at the exact same time that Jose Arguelles had his idea. And this was the great psychedelic philosopher and raconteur, Terence McKenna. His work, The Invisible Landscape, which was also printed in 1975. And it was the first mention of 2012. Again, he hadn't really dialed it into specifically December 21st, 2012, but in the first edition of The Invisible Landscape, which is McKenna's big thesis about the nature of time, he talks about 2012 being a transformational moment. So there's remarkable synchronicity between these two people, basically catching on to the fact that the Mayan calendrical system is kind of potentially describing this transformational cycle. And then as Terence developed his time wave zero theory, By the 1992 edition of The Invisible Landscape, he kind of tied this vision in, again, specifically to December 21st, 2012, the end of the Mayan calendar. So let's say a little bit about Terence's work and his vision, and time wave zero. Well, what time wave zero is another interpretation of the nature of time. So we had a very brief look at the Mayan calendrical system, and the fact that what we have here is this biologically resonant counting system, which also reflects these harmonies of planetary orbits and other things. And what Terence McKenna and Dennis, his brother, kind of like tuned into was a narrative around the Chinese oracle of the I Ching. And under the influence of kind of fairly large doses of psychedelic mushrooms, they had the inspiration that the I Ching was really tuning us into a much, much deeper understanding of time than the one that we currently inhabit. We have an understanding of time in the Western world that's been reduced to a quantity. We talk about time as money and spending time. What we don't talk about is the nature of time. There's always a now moment, and that now moment has a quality to it as well as a quantity. So for instance, I mean, how many people here have experienced the different quality of a new moon compared with a full moon? Raise your hands. Experience that? Like, a new moon feels different from a full moon. And in fact, there is statistical evidence to suggest that humans behave differently during a full moon. There's more cases of lunacy, more outbreaks of you know, kind of like disturbance in the mental field, and also just, you know, general kind of, it's an energized time as opposed to an inward and reflective time. And it's this notion of time, time is a quality that we've lost touch with in Western society. So in a way, both of these people, Terence McKenna and Jose Arguelles, are really getting interested again in the idea of a quality of time, because what the I Ching does, it's an oracle, and it's based on a sequence of 64 different permutations, 64 different hexagrams, and these hexagrams can be determined by throwing coins randomly, or yarrow stalks, and the outcome of those different permutations basically has a different quality of time. So it's kind of like, from the Western perspective, a truly mystical, unscientific, and frankly crazy idea that, like, by doing something random, you can actually directly tap into the quality of the now moment. So what Terence then did is he said, well, what if actually what was happening in the I Ching is the true notion of time? That the notion of time that we have as duration, the notion of time as money, the notion of spending time is a superficial, fairly kind of trivial notion of time. What's going on is a succession of now moments that have different qualities, that have a narrative kind of story to them as well. So again, it's this idea of them having meaning, them having story. And then he went on to do a kind of like fractal analysis of this particular sequence of the I Ching, called the King-Wen sequence, which he, this is sort of pictured as this very beautiful diagram, this spiraling motion on the right-hand side. And what he picked up was a mathematical progression within the sequence of the 64 hexagrams that he could extrapolate from to say that actually, well, what could be happening here is we could be embedded in a fractal time wave, which is coming to a point of concrescence, a point where basically everything is coming together towards. It's almost like the opposite idea of the Western kind of scientific notion of the Big Bang. Like, we have this notion of time began at one particular moment and it's expanding outwards from there. So Terence had this idea, which was completely the opposite of that, is that in fact what we're heading towards is a moment of infinite novelty, a moment of infinite change, that we are heading towards something which is completely, fundamentally transformational. And he pinpointed that moment, that transformational kind of apex, as December 21st, 2012. So I don't really have time to go much more deeply into the work of Jose Arguelles or Terence McKenna, both of which are really fascinating. Because what I want to do is just want to stay on this theme of December 21st, 2012, and also point to a third theory which has emerged out of this, which is also really part of the kind of like the significant meaning of the transformative vision of 2012. And that's the work of John Major Jenkins. Now, John Major Jenkins wrote a book in 1998 called Maya Cosmogenesis, which was really a distillation of the work that he had done, looking at the Mayan calendrical system, but also looking at a kind of like synergistic vision of the Mayan cosmovision. And it's kind of interesting that one of the people that influenced him was Terence McKenna. So what does this theory really say about this particular moment? Well, what we have to do is we have to delve a little bit into the astronomy of the idea of galactic alignment. So what John Major Jenkins noticed about this 5,125 year cycle, the 13 back-to count of the Maya, ending on December 21st, 2012, is that it's kind of a remarkable synchronicity or coincidence that it happens to end on a winter solstice. And he thought, well, is there meaning to this? Because the calendar itself doesn't actually talk about solstices or equinoxes, but perhaps he thought they're pointing to something that's not in the calendar, that's in the Mayan cosmovision, but isn't actually encoded in the calendar. And then he looked into kind of other potential kind of significant things which are happening at this particular moment. And what he noticed was that the winter solstice sunrise in this particular era, it's kind of like a 35-ish year period, basically rises conjunct with the galactic equator on winter solstice. So he thought, is this what the Maya are pointing to? This particular galactic alignment. Now, this galactic alignment isn't something which happens when our planet crosses the galactic equator physically. It's not that the sun and the solar system are crossing the galactic plane. What it is, it's a phenomenon caused by something called the precession of the equinoxes. And what that is if you observe the rising of a star on a particular day of the year, what you'll see is that, let's keep it simple and talk about the sun. If you observe the rising of the sun, say, on the winter solstice, what you'll see is that the position, the stellar background against which that sun rises, moves. So pretty much every 72 years, the sun will move a single degree in the sky. So for it to move 360 degrees against the perceived stellar background takes it about 25,771 years. And this is what's known in Western astrology as the Great Year. So when people talk about we're moving into the age of Aquarius, what they're talking about is the progression which happens because of this precessional cycle. So the great kind of like insight that John brought to this was that, okay, we know the Maya are tracking the cycles of the Earth, the Moon, Venus, all of these different visible planets. What if they were also tracking precession? And actually, the whole of their calendrical system is pointing towards a alignment with the winter solstice sunrise and the galactic equator. Now that's something which is actually, he shows, reflected in the Maya cosmovision. Because, from the northern hemisphere, the galaxy, or the Milky Way, is not such a prominent nighttime feature as it is in the more central latitudes of Guatemala, Mexico, where the Maya civilization was and is. So, in their culture, you've got away from light pollution, obviously, you've got on clear nights this massive vista of the Milky Way, which basically stretches right across the sky. And our star system, is about 26,000 light years out from the galactic center. But when we look back towards the galactic center, what we see is not a bright thing, because we're so distant from it. What we actually are seeing are interstellar dust clouds that obscure it. So the actual picture that you get is this kind of dark rift in the sky. So we looked at the Mayan ball court, and this is a ubiquitous game that's played all over Mesoamerican cultures, and it's found pretty much in most of the ceremonial centers of the Maya, is this ball court. So it's a game which is played by two different teams of players, and they use their elbows and knees primarily to maneuver this little rubber ball through a tiny ring, which is mounted high on these kind of like steps. And what he saw in a really potent insight is that the ball is a representation of the sun, and the gold ring is a representation of the galactic equator. And the dark rift, which is where the galactic equator is is something which is very much part of the Mayan mythology. It's seen as Xibalba, which is basically the underworld. So what we're seeing in this mythically in the galactic alignment which is happening in this era, this 35-year period, is a kind of like joining of the sun in the dark rift. So what we're having here is, it's kind of like what the Maya saw Xibalba as is not just the underworld, but the place of birth. And we already had this idea, even in the 260-day cycle, that the Maya were talking about cycles of birth. And in a lot of the glyphs that exist with the Mayan inscriptions, you'll see, in, for instance, the accession of a king, that they'll be being born out of the mouth of a frog. And this is another interpretation of the meaning of Xibalba. So this is a potent idea, galactic alignment theory. And I was writing to John Major Jenkins recently and speaking about like the actual origin point of this idea. And he told me actually it was the key insight of galactic alignment theory came to him after he exchanged several letters with Terence, back when there were letters, in 1992 and 1993. So, now to quote John, he said, "I exchanged several letters with Terence, which triggered a revisiting of the alignment thing. I looked at Norton Star Atlas, got out my Easy Cosmos software, and internalized how the sky shifted. I got it." So we have this heritage, this kind of like, this three-part kind of like set of ideas which form a coherent body that are basically saying something which is very, very similar. They're talking about 2012 being a time of transformation, and they're all rooted in the Mayan calendrical system, or the notion of a quality of time. So that really is the essence, in a way, of the transformative vision. You know, there's a lot of people who speculate about what may happen in 2012, but a lot of times what you're getting is just people's personal speculations. They're not really tuning into what is specifically unique about this moment. So these three people all were, and now what I'd like to do very briefly is to kind of contrast that with the origin points of the idea that it's the end of the world. Anyone have any ideas about like where that idea came from?
Well, John, I'm so glad to hear you beautifully describe John Jenkins' theories. He's one of my closest friends. And in the 2012 story, John points out that contrary to all the academic gatekeepers that were always giving him, mocking the 2012 apocalypticism, which should be mocked from a certain perspective, it actually originated with Sebastian, a Mayan scholar.
Thank you. Jonathan, yeah?
Yes, Jonathan.
Yeah, precisely. Michael Coe. See, the thing is that a lot of people ridicule people talking about 2012 as a time of transformation and say, it's not the end of the world, you hippies got it all wrong. Not that hippies ever said it was the end of the world. And this is a classic disinformation tactic. So where did this idea come from? Well, it came from academic Mayanists. It came specifically from the work of Michael Coe. In 1966, he wrote the book, The Maya, which is one of the most widely read and distributed books about the Maya. And in it, he said very blatantly, there was a suggestion that Armageddon would take over the generic peoples of the world and all creation on the final day of the 13th Bactun, and thus our present universe would be annihilated, which is really hardcore. You know, the thing is that he then backed that up in 1992 and kind of made a little joke about it and said, long count dates are given in a day-to-day count which began in this year and will end, perhaps with a bang, in 2012. So, thanks academic Mayanists for ridiculing us, but actually it's your idea. And not only can we pinpoint it specifically to the work of Michael Coe, but the movie 2012, the movie, conducted by Roland Emmerich, which is effectively one of the major reasons that 10% of the world's population think it's the end of the world. And if we believe that intention and our belief systems have some effect on reality, that's not really very optimal. Because, you know, if what you believe tends to come as true, and 10% of the world's population think the world's going to end, it's kind of a drag factor on, basically, human evolution in some ways. So we can actually tap into the archaeology of this idea of apocalypse and trace its lineage in the same way that we trace the lineage of the transformative vision back to Terence McKenna and Jose Arguelles, and then influencing basically the work of John Major Jenkins. Because Roland Emmerich cites the work of Graham Hancock, and specifically Fingerprints of the Gods, as his principal influence for the movie 2012. And Graham Hancock in that book is basically simply quoting Michael Coe. So that is basically where this idea of the end of the world came from. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep on this informational tip, because I really want to share some of the latest news and discoveries about 2012. A lot of the Mayan scholars spent years and years and years when they were questioned by people like Jeff Stray and John Major Jenkins saying, there's nothing to do with 2012, that's rubbish, you know, there's no inscriptions. There's one. This is the most famous one, and the reason it's famous blatantly is because of the work of Jeff Stray and John Major Jenkins. And actually, the Mayan academics and archaeologists discovered this a long time ago and decided it really wasn't worth research. Well, all it is an inscription which basically, it's a site called Tortuguero, which was kind of like a related site to Palenque, and it's a monument which basically celebrates the ascension of a king. And what it does is it compares his birth date and the astronomical things which are happening on that date to the astronomical things, the very significant astronomical things, i.e. the Galactic conjunction, specifically as well, which is happening on December 21st, 2012. So we had academic Mayanists for a while. Just a second, I need some water. Dust. So you have academic Mayanists basically saying this doesn't exist, and then independent researchers, epigraphers, reading these inscriptions and saying, well, actually what it says here is in the corner, basically on December 21st, 2012, this stuff is going to happen. And what you can read on the slide, excuse me, is the latest interpretation by the Mayan epigrapher Barbara McLeod. And on this day 4, How 3 Kankin, which is the Mayan way of writing December 21st, 2012, she's talking about there is a display of the Bolognocti in the Great Investiture Return. And what the Bolognocti are these ninefold gods. In fact, there's a theory, and this is one I concur with. I mean, I do a little bit of research myself, but I think that the Bolognocti, who are kind of like described in this monument, are very much related to the Bolontiku. The Bolontiku are the 9 gods of the underworld, very significant Mayan gods. And again, we're talking about Xibalba, the dark rift, the underworld. We're returning to this point of creation, of rebirth, of renewal, of transformation. So we have this inscription which basically says that these gods are returning. That's what it says. That's what the Mayan epigraphers say. And it's also the interpretation that we have. It's just that when we mention it, they say stuff like, oh, the glyphs might not even be on that day, which is, that's David Stewart, is one of the, I mean, he's basically one of the top 5 Mayan epigraphers worldwide. And his friend, Steve Houston, who's another professor of Mayan archaeology, said, well, you know, whatever it says, it doesn't really have anything to do with 2012, nothing to do with prophecy or the supposed dread events that await us in AD 2012. Oh, hang on a minute, that's Michael Coe's idea. So it's actually what's happening here is the Mayan academics are actually arguing against their own ideas and kind of putting down anybody who's talking about it being a transformational time and basically doing whatever they can to make this thing seem trivial. And this is a classic quote. Oh, about 2012, the Mayans are notably silent, or truth be told, a bit boring. So these 9 gods are returning from the underworld. It's a time of transformational renewal, and that's a bit boring. Okay, so it took ages for the Mayan academics to actually admit there was a 2012 inscription, and it was kind of interesting that another one was found this year. Even David Stewart said, wow, we found another 2012 inscription this year. So here we are, and it's a site called La Corona, And in the bottom right-hand corner, what you're seeing is the date for Hal 3 Kin, which is December 21st, 2012. And it's talking about this 13 Keton Lord. And what the Mayan kings were doing, they were kind of bigging themselves up. It's just kind of like graffiti, basically, or boasting. Mayan kings were very, very concerned about the astrological significance of their birth dates and their ascension dates. And kind of lineage in the right to have, you know, a throne was very much like, well, how kind of significant is your astronomy, basically? So there was this kind of competition going on, and this is the accession date of Ayun Kahak of Kaknur. And it talks about his ascension date, and it compares it and says, wow, I'm born on this really significant date, and it's connected to this even more significant date, 2012. So what do the Mayan academics say? Well, they say, this new evidence suggests it's quite important, but the ancient Maya, however, would make no apocalyptic prophecies about it whatsoever. Okay. Well, yeah, that again is a Mayanist idea. So, you know, what they're doing is classic disinformation. Disinformation isn't telling people lies, it's giving people a narrative. And how you do that is you give people facts, but you don't give them all of the facts, and you place the facts in a context which make them incomprehensible. So if you start with a false premise, the false premise being that the Mayan calendar is the end of the world, and then what you do is you disprove the false premise by saying, no, it's not the end of the world, we've proven that. So that's what they've been doing. They've basically been saying that it's not a time of transformation because it's not the end of the world, and yet the two stories are very, very separate. And David Stewart again stepped up and said, this is just a literary device. Well, yes. What precedent is there for a literary device being used in Mayan epigraphy? There's only one, it's the Tortuguero monument. And what these Mayan kings are saying is like, we're really important because we're related to 2012. So my argument here is, what I'm saying is that the reading of 2012 being a time of transformation isn't speculation. It's written in Mayan epigraphy. If you can read these inscriptions, this is what it says. This is what we're talking about here now. And what the Mayanists are saying is basically just disproving their own kind of incorrect information. So you can argue that, yeah, it's not the end of the world and laugh at the hippies. But actually, you know, we're learning to read these inscriptions. And thanks to people like John Major Jenkins and Jeff Strayer, amazing researchers, completely independent of any funding. And they're just being persistent and being ridiculed. You know, one of the things that really concerns me is that if you study Mayan calendrics or Mayan archaeology in a contemporary university, and you talk about John Major Jenkins, they'll laugh at you. They'll call him a fraud or a New Ager. And actually, there's nothing New Age about John Major Jenkins' work. He's not talking about like angels and spirits and, you know, wouldn't it all be lovely if we all lived in peace together. What he's talking about is Mayan archaeology. So there's more. There was a amazing set of glyphs and murals discovered at a site called Zoltan recently. And what was really special about this site was that they had a series of astronomical tables that were found in this site, written on the wall, written by a Mayan kind of like scholar, priest, scribe, and they included the working out. So it's like a work in progress. It's like crossing out and all that kind of stuff. And they're tables of the periods of Mars and Venus and lunar eclipses, and they go 6,000 years into the future. So how was this reported in the world's media? It was basically, well, this is another way of showing this thing. And if you're a Mayan epigraphic geek, which I am, if you look on the third column, second one down, there's 3 bars and 2 dots, which is kind of, wow. They're talking about dates beyond 2012. So yes, they're talking about dates beyond 2012, and how it was reported in the international world media was so much for the supposed end of the world. Yeah, thanks. So basically, they're just arguing against their own theory. Now, the thing is that nobody who's talking about 2012 being a time of transformation is saying that it's the end of the world. And in fact, for a long time, we've been talking about inscriptions, Mayan inscriptions, which go way beyond 2012. And this is, well, I mean, I'm going to drop in this, just to reiterate this point and kind of rub it home, I'm just going to say this one more time, and name the kind of guilty party in this case. This is Anthony Aveni, who's a really amazing naked eye astronomer, and that's his specialty, and he knows nothing pretty much about the calendrical systems. But he's like, in all the media saying, you know, this thing in 2012, it's just like the odometer of a car, it turns over, you know, it's no big deal, it means nothing. He also said, I love this. He also said, you know, there aren't many mysteries left because science has decoded most of them. Really? Wow. And, you know, to contrast that, I mean, how ridiculous this is, this notion that it means nothing, that it's just this arbitrary thing, it's just a number turning over. Well, we have literally dozens of books of Mayan prophecies called the Books of the Children of the Lamb, and these were prophecies that were basically recorded by Mayan scribes and priests before or around the time of the conquest and have been kept. And what they do, they don't really talk about the long count because Mayan civilization kind of lost that like hundreds of years before the European invasions. But what they do talk about is prophecies all of the time. And they talk about prophecies on the Ahau day. Now, if you remember way back at the beginning of this talk, we were talking about the Ahau day being the 20th day. And that's a really significant day for the Maya. The whole of the Great Cycle, the 5,125-year cycle, finishes on 4 Ahau. It's an Ahau day. Ahau days are days of prophecy. And the Books of the Children of the Lamb, all of these books that were written in all these different centers by all the different Mayan scribes, all talk about prophecies that are all keyed to Ahau days. They are prophecies keyed to a Tun, which is 360 days, ending on an Ahau day, or K-Tuns, which are 20 Tuns, so 20 years approximately, ending on an Ahau day. So the idea that a 13 Bacton cycle, which is 5,200 Tun, ending on December 21st, 2012, has no special significance whatsoever. That's what Mark Van Stone and other Mayan academics said. Is absurd. It's just ridiculous. So, you know, again, like just kind of, I recently presented this at a conference, so it's kind of like probably a little more in depth than I wanted to go, but I'm kind of just going to mention basically that there's a recent paper in American Anthropologist which basically exposes how Mayan academics have kind of manufactured consent for a considerable period of time and basically cherry-pick their evidence. You know, I'll be writing about that online soon, so I'll be talking about that there. So yeah, I mentioned dates beyond 2012, and this is one. This is actually from Palenque, and it's an interesting rivalry that happened between Tortuguero and Palenque. They're very close to each other, and for a long period of their history, Tortuguero were kind of a vassal city. There's a great kind of like history in the Mayan city-states of competition between the different city-states and battles and people taking over different cities, and then these claims for lineage. I am the king of all of these cities because I'm born on the day that Jupiter conjuncted the Dark Rift, and, you know, blah, blah, blah. So the thing about the Tortuguero monument was that basically Tortuguero dialed the 13 Bacton. They really got the 2012 prophecy, and they kind of like were getting dangerously close to being considered the direct descendants of the Palenque kings. So it's quite interesting. We have this notion, the great Mayan figure of Lord Pakal. And has anyone here been to Palenque? One or two people. Yeah, cool. So have you been to there's an amazing pyramid called the Temple of Inscriptions, and within that there is this incredible sarcophagi, which is the sarcophagi of Pakal, and it's the most amazing piece of carved Mayan kind of like glyphery and artwork that, you know, it's a legendary piece. And you know what? It was a piece of PR. It was kind of like basically like Pakal was invented by Chamberlain, his son, because he needed basically to like have some serious Mayan bling on his side, because Tortuguero were dangerously close to claiming his throne. So he came up with this inscription, which he put at the top of the pyramid, and he said, basically, Pakal is coming back at the end of the 20th Bacton. You know, Lord Jaguarover and Tortuguero might have claimed 2012, but we're coming back in 4772. So the people that have been talking about transformation have been talking about the fact there are dates beyond 2012 forever, and we've been using this as evidence to show that these period endings are really, really significant. But the reason that the Mayan academics are not telling people about this is very simply because it doesn't fit the narrative. What they want to do is basically control the dialogue. They're not basically telling you lies, they're telling you about new discoveries, but what they're doing is they're framing it within a context which is basically deceitful. They're talking about it as being not the end of the world, and then making you make the inference that all these hippies talking about transformation are basically like wrong. And that's the way that the message gets. And what I've seen is basically a systemic campaign of disinformation to stop people talking about 2012 being a time of transformation to the point of having a systemic campaign against the people doing that. So, that's why John Major Jenkins is ridiculed in academic universities. And it's also why Mayan academics who make friends with John Major Jenkins are ridiculed and marginalized. It's because basically, if you want funding, don't mention 2012. So this again is the amazing Temple of Inscriptions from Palenque. Can we have a time check? How much more time do we have? How are we doing? 9? 15, okay, so we have about 15 minutes left. So I'm going to leave you with a quote from John because I think it really does sum it up. The evidence indicates the Mayan concept for cycle endings such as 2012 is transformation and renewal. And that's really what I wanted to get across in this talk. I'm going to go into, maybe elaborating a little bit more. And I'm actually going to be talking again tomorrow in the other dome, Area 51. I'm doing a bit of a conversation with Daniel Pinchbeck because a lot of my research has actually been to look at, okay, well, if 2012 is a time of transformation, what is that transformation? How is it working? Is it like a physical thing? We have this amazing galactic alignment that the Maya were talking about. What did they understand that we don't understand? It's only in 1935 that we discovered that we're part of the galaxy. That's when Western astronomy became galactic. Now, it's a jump to actually say that the Maya knew what the galaxy was, because actually, you can determine a galactic alignment, i.e. like the position of the sun conjunct the dark rift with about 150 years of astronomical observations. And it's not really about the galaxy, it's about the cycle of precession, but it's kind of interesting. So this is kind of like a taster. I don't know how much we're going to fit in here, but if you want to come tomorrow, it's at 5 p.m. and it's across the way. And I'll also be speaking in Red Lightning on Saturday in a kind of like a mashup with a few other people that kind of have similar ideas. Adam Apollo, I think Jamie Janover is going to be there. We're going to talk about a whole bunch of stuff. I'm going to particularly in that one focus about how the solar cycles, the 11-year sunspot cycle, affects human consciousness and social organization. So, the way that I grew up when I was a kid, and I learned about the solar system is when I opened a book, I saw something like this. It's like the sun's at the center, there's these 9 planets, they're moving around in elliptical orbits. Okay, that's what it is. It all seems very stable, nothing to worry about there. The sun's going to be burning for a few more billion years, it's doing its thing. This worldview is a very interesting worldview because it's kind of collapsing. This is something that Asim Haran talks about. Since we discovered we're traveling around the galaxy, that whole worldview of us being on a planet which is in an elliptical orbit around the sun, and the sun is a static thing, has basically collapsed. And the new way of looking at what's actually happening on our planet is that we have to realize we're moving more quickly with the sun than we are around the sun. We're totally wedded to the journey that the sun is making around the galaxy. And the sun moves around the galaxy in an orbit which takes 225 million years. This is kind of a really amazing piece of research that was done by the Open University, and it's kind of a graphic description of the galaxy, and each of these coloured bars are the spiral arms, and within that you can see, hopefully, there's a kind of blue line, a blue circle or ellipse, which is the orbit of the sun around the galaxy, and at the top you've got where we are now. We're kind of leaving the Sagittarius arm of our galaxy. And what the researchers at Open University discovered is that major extinction events on our planet occur pretty much at the time that we're either entering or leaving one of the spiral arms. So that the big dinosaur extinction at the end of the Cretaceous period, 65 million years ago, basically happened when we left the Sagittarius arm. So this is a completely different way of seeing the position of the Earth in relationship to the cosmos. We're used to this notion, which is kind of like we're one of 9 planets, we're kind of important, and there's the sun and everything's stable, the sun's going to be burning. Actually what's happening is that the processes of life on Earth are being completely determined by the sun's journey around the galaxy. And evolution itself is being driven by that. In fact, there's more evidence as well, just to show, it's the work of an astrophysicist based in New York called Nir Shaviv, and he analysed meteorite samples from a 650 million year period, and he determined that the major driver of climate change on our planet is the galactic orbit of the sun around the galaxy. So we are not the dinosaurs, because basically what we are is we're the atoms of the Earth rearranged further along on its galactic journey. And this is really the new story about what is happening on our planet. It's not about us being in this really, really stable worldview where basically we're just, rotating around the Earth 1 year per year, and that the sun isn't doing anything. The sun is moving. And instead of being a stable kind of universe, actually what we've discovered is it's a really, really dynamic one. If you're used to thinking about space as being empty, it's actually kind of a mistake. Space isn't empty, it's full of energy. And there are energy gradients. There's basically, in interstellar space, there is plasmic energy. And there's kind of gradients of greater or lesser plasma in the interstellar space medium. And how that works with the interaction of our solar system and the sun is that as the sun moves around the galaxy, it kind of like compresses a bubble around the solar system, which is called the heliosphere. So it's illustrated up here. So you can see the sun moving, and there's this bow shock wave, which basically like pushes the plasma that the sun encounters around the heliosphere. So it's like we're moving through interstellar space in this energetic bubble. And research done by Russian scientists at the Russian Academy of Sciences, especially with this guy, Alexei Dmitriev, have shown the amount of plasma entering the heliosphere has increased tenfold in the last 10 years. So the amount of plasma that's actually like entering the solar system is increasing dramatically. So we're actually in a period of dynamic change. And it's the theory of Dmitriev that it's largely this plasma which is responsible for climate change both on our planet and all the other planets throughout the solar system. So it's a completely different worldview that we're entering into. It's basically this very stable kind of like static paradigm is collapsing, and what we're re-emerging into is a notion of a much more dynamic world. I mean, we're moving faster with the sun than we are around it, and also much longer cycles of time. I mean, we orbit the galaxy in a 225 million year orbit. So we're beginning to learn a lot more in a short period of time about what this planet actually is and what our relationship is to it. And I'm actually a great fan of space probes. I know some people are like, oh, it's materialistic and all that, but I love satellites and that kind of scientific discovery. And it's kind of amazing what has been happening in discoveries about basically compiling all the data from all the different probes that have been put up by different space agencies. And work done by NASA recently using a bunch of data from probes like Themis and this cluster probe, which are basically measuring magnetic fields. Found some really interesting stuff. It basically found that our planet and the sun is directly connected by a magnetic channel. There's literally a physical magnetic connection between the sun and the Earth, and it's like these vortices which come from the sun and basically spiral down to our planet, and they basically hit the equator of the Earth and penetrate through its magnetic fields every 8 minutes. It's like what we're discovering here is this is the real clock. This is the real, these are the pulses of the sun. And this is a physical thing. When it kind of like punches its way through the magnetosphere, it brings in cosmic rays, with basically these highly charged heavy particles from outer space. So there are physical connections happening. And I just throw this in to show that we're really at the very, very beginning of understanding our planet as an electromagnetic system that is fundamentally and completely dependent on its relationship to the sun. We're not independent. We're going nowhere without it. And it's only now that we're beginning to see that there's an interplay which is like deeply and massively connected to it. So this again is just like a kind of snapshot, just a few like kind of ideas that I'm going to throw in there. And it would be amiss to talk about 2012 without at least kind of touching on the ideas of Teilhard de Chardin. He's an amazing philosopher who's very much influenced Jose Arguelles and the work of Terence McKenna, so very much embedded in the idea of the transformative vision. Although he didn't pinpoint the idea of this transformative period being in 2012, he articulated it beautifully. He talked about there being an omega point, an idea of a culminating moment of evolution at a specific point in the near future that we're moving towards. And it's almost the opposite worldview of the Big Bang. It's kind of like a big crunch of evolution. It's not like the world was created out of randomness and is kind of heading towards an entropic heat death. It's actually that like things are weaving together into a more and more meaningful web of synchronicity and intelligence that basically is creating something called the noosphere. And that's like, you can think of that as a kind of like thinking layer of the planet. And the talk I'm going to be giving tomorrow is going to really go into this electromagnetic idea of consciousness, the relationship of individual human consciousness to the planet and how those things actually work on an electromagnetic level. So again, another articulation of this idea is being spiral time. 2012 being this kind of like point which we're spiraling to this vortex of compression, which is leading us to a potentiality of transformation, an omega point where we could really emerge into something different. So there's a few other things I could talk about. I just briefly want to talk about an initiative which I think is a really cool counterbalance to the fear-mongering about the end of the world, which is the Peace 2012 project. And that's really talking about bringing as much positivity as possible to December 21st, 2012 by focusing our intention in a shared, coherent meditation at the exact point of winter solstice, which happens at 11:11. And there are a couple of events happening at Teotihuacan, which is a major ceremonial site near Mexico City, and Stonehenge, and all of these places linking up. So it's a bit like, what we're seeing potentially here is this transformational awakening. I think a lot of people who were interested in 2012 look at 2012 and say, well, why isn't it happening? Well, it kind of is happening. It's just that we have to reclaim our narrative. We have to understand that the idea that 2012 is a point of transformational is incredible. It's not just based on flaky new age, whatever. And in fact, there's nothing wrong with, channeling or being intuitive or, all of those things. It's just that what is happening in the mainstream media is that we're being marginalized and ridiculed where it's completely inappropriate. And actually, the people who are doing that don't really have much to say. And, when you really scratch away at their conclusions, there isn't a lot there. So, if you'd like to know more, I wrote a book about all this stuff, which is called The Everything Guide to 2012. And you can get that in your local independent bookstore, or you can order it online. And it basically talks about all of these different theories, so you can take a look at that. And yeah, I'm going to be here doing a couple more talks at Burning Man, and doing some writing for some online sites like Reality Sandwich. So, yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you.